I'm Richard Waller, Executive Director of the University Museums at the University of Richmond. We are delighted that you have joined us this evening, have found us this evening, for the opening of our exhibition, Leon Bible, Art, Activism, and the WPA, on view in the Laura Robbins Gallery of Design from Nature. The exhibition was organized by the University Museums and was guest curated by Phyllis Wrynn. It is presented as part of a year-long interdisciplinary focus on arts and activism at the University of Richmond. Activist art can have many different meanings and can challenge us in different ways. Several of the performing arts programs being presented by the Modeling Center this academic year are exploring how the arts influence our society. Our exhibition on the works of Leon Bible offers a very special perspective on the power of activist art during the turbulent years of the Great Depression and its relevance to our own society today. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to acknowledge two very special guests in our audience: Leon Bible's daughter, Elaine Cater, and his grandson, Julian Cater. They're here in the third row. They have traveled from England to be with us this evening, and we're very delighted to have them here to be part of this celebration of the work of Leon Bible. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers, Phyllis Wrynn and Keith Sheridan. Phyllis Wrynn has been the director for almost 30 years of the Park Slope Gallery, an independent art gallery in Brooklyn. Phyllis curated a retrospective exhibition of the photographs of George Fors in 1994, and she is currently working on a book of his New York photographs. Several of her photographs and a project she has worked on for several years were accepted by the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York. And I haven't had a chance to ask her about that project, but we can do that at the reception. Phyllis worked closely with Leon Bible before he passed away in 1995. Since that time, she has managed and promoted the Leon Bible estate. 2 years ago, she curated an exhibition of Leon Bible's work for the Gershwin Y in Philadelphia. Phyllis wrote and produced the remarkable film on Leon Bible that you will see in our exhibition this evening. Keith Sheridan received his BFA from Pratt Institute. He has had a long career in graphic design and opened his own design firm in New York. His many clients included the New York City Ballet, the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater, the Santa Fe Opera, Gap, and Random House, to name a few. His firm's work has won more than 35 awards for excellence, and several have been included in the permanent collection of the Library of Congress. Keith's love of fine prints led him to establish a fine print business. In 2006, after 10 years in the field, he was voted a member of the International Fine Print Dealers Association. His area of specialization is American fine prints from the first half of the 20th century, and especially works of art created during the WPA era. Following the lecture, if we have time, we will take a few questions, and then please join us for the reception and to see the exhibition. The title of their talk this evening is The Art and Activism of Leon Bible. Phyllis will speak first, and then Keith will follow. Please hold your questions until both of them have spoken. Please join me in welcoming Phyllis Wrynn and Keith Sheridan. And I'm supposed to be the tech person.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to Katrina and Matthew and David and Stephen and all the people who helped to transport art and information across the internet, across state lines and the internet. I had the great pleasure to know the artist Leon Bible very well. I worked with him at his studio in curating an exhibition in 1994 of his WPA art. Sorry. Thank you, honey. My son is my tech assistant. Thank you. He was a remarkable man, very gifted and talented in many ways, and he was immensely kind and dedicated to his art and to his family. I'm delighted that Elaine and Julian are with us tonight. It is a special privilege to be able to honor him and his work with this exhibition. I'll try to keep to the formal as I can, but Leon will always be Leon to me, so I might lapse again during my talk. And I thank beyond imagination my husband, Mitch, who lost me to research and writing most of the last few months and was so supportive in every way. And without, to paraphrase, getting all Academy Awardee, thank you to my son, Dylan, for his insight and encouragement with this process. He gave me some sage advice, which I endeavored to absorb. And thank you to friends and to family who have traveled to Richmond for this event. I'm very moved by having you with us. It's a very special moment to share. And the last thing is I do want to mention that all the art that you will see is by Leon Bible, and the except when I do refer to other artists. Okay. So let's give it a start. It's unique to get to know an established artist, one who's worked through many decades, through stylistic changes, whose studio is intact, and who is full of stories. Add to this a behind-the-scenes look at the most comprehensive public art project in the history of the country, and the result is dizzying and wonderful. Leon Bible was born in 1913. He emigrated from Poland with his family as a young boy and settled in California. He studied at the California School of Fine Arts in San Francisco and worked on several fresco projects with Bernard Sackheim, and I'm going to just go through a few images here. Sackheim was a colleague of the great Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, and we have a pen and ink that Leon did of Sackheim working on a fresco. The celebrated artist George Siegel and Leon Bible were great friends. They had lived across the road from one another in rural New Jersey since the early 1940s. Siegel used Leon as a model in many of his sculptural installations. And we're very lucky here in Richmond because in DC, there is the sculptural program to honor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Leon is the first figure in George's breadline. And we have another shot of him. And so we see him in bronze, slightly more than life size. Siegel was a very good friend of Leon's, and he wrote these poignant and poetic observations about him. The first in 1966. Man entrapped, man aspiring, workers unite, jagged movements, the melancholy of gaunt faces, sagging shoulders, the siren call of Paris, but don't unclench your teeth. And he wrote in 1992, I've known Leon since the early 40s. He was an angry young man, emigre from San Francisco on the WPA, painting pictures full of cubist angles and realist imagery and protest against the system that couldn't make room for this robust, cheerful, optimistic, gentle man. It is also impossible for a man this sensitive, responsive, and intelligent not to respond to the dark side of our own history. And Bible's Am I Blue, painted in the 1930s, quite perfectly illustrates Siegel's assessment. I feel I need to give some background on the Depression here. In 1936, at the height of the Depression, Leon Bible came to New York City eager to work on the WPA. Herbert Hoover had been heroic as he ran government food aid programs after World War I. So it was ironic that he was so opposed to government intervention in the face of such an economic crisis. That failure to act resulted in the crash of 1929, morphing into the Great Depression. FDR and his advisors had seen the results of inaction and sought to use the government as an ally. An extremely progressive group was assembled to figure out a way to jolt the nation back on its feet. Harry Hopkins, whose work FDR knew well in New York, was asked to head a federal jobs program. the WPA, or the Works Project Administration, rose up to try to correct the massive failure in society and government. Hopkins believed that getting a paycheck was preferable to simply getting a handout, and saw the need to restore and preserve morale and skills and talents. He also believed that the material enrichments, what would be produced by these artists and workers, would be an asset to the nation. 8.8 million workers were mobilized, and it was the largest peacetime undertaking in American history. For example, the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, and this is a statue honoring a CCC worker in Letchworth State Park, which is upstate in New York. They cleared brush and built bridges and all kinds of incredible projects. They built our national parks. Infrastructure, that wonderful word, infrastructure. And Leon worked as an art supervisor in the CCC, and his discharge papers are actually in the display case in the exhibition. It was good, hard work, and the workers learned skills for the future. The recognition that artists were also suffering. Great hardship led to the creation of the Federal Art Project, or the FAP. The three goals of the FAP were the production of art education, and art research. Federal art centers, studios, and workshops sprang up throughout the country. Federal theaters put on plays, and there were writing, music, and photography documentation projects as well. The various projects and workshops were phenomenally successful in moving people from despair and feelings of failure to a sense of self-worth. The spirit of cooperation and the ability to participate fully in society literally saved people's lives. In 1993, trained professionals telephoned Americans in every, I apologize, hurts the eyes, but there's a point. They telephoned Americans in every demographic to find out what they most wanted in painting. 102 questions went to 1,001 adults in a very scientific gathering of the answer. Two Soviet emigre conceptual artists, Komar and Melamed, conceived of this project with the Nation Institute. They then did a composite painting based on the cumulative results of the questionnaire. This awful, vapid, soulless drivel had what people wanted: blue skies, water, some animals, a historical figure. The overriding takeaway was that the image should easily wash over the eyes and not make you think. When you enter this exhibition, it will be the antithesis of this collective desire for nothing that offends, challenges, or confronts. In the mid-1930s, when most of the work on exhibition was created, the Great Depression had caused a generalized anxiety to take hold in America. Whether it was hunger and unemployment, inequality and uncertainty, or news of the war on the horizon. Other than the very wealthy sliver at the top, the country was suffering. For the poorest, it was an unimaginable struggle. Bible, I'm sorry, I have a little problem with the fact that I'm not using the computer that I always do, so please forgive me. And here we are. Bible created this spare etching of a drowning man, eyes hollowed out, trying to stay afloat, but losing against the swift current. In the expressionistic push too far, our subject is literally painted into a corner, his head in hand, defeated, but his fist firmly on the table. Despondent Couple shows the influence of the Mexican muralists and Cubism, and again, our subjects are painted into a corner, the metaphor for how so many people felt at that time. The powerful composition War Extra shows the newsies wailing to sell his papers, and the panic of the young man on the street upon hearing the news. The few elements are so very compressed, and war practically screams itself. And I'm going to show now two watercolors by Leon that were made on site at protests. And Stuart Davis commented, "An increasing expression of social problems of the day in the new American art makes it clear that in times such as we are living in, few artists can honestly remain aloof, wrapped up in studio problems. But the artist has not simply looked out of the window, he has had to step onto the street, that step onto the picket line, it implies a militancy on the part of the American artists peculiar to the 1930s. The economic collapse that began in 2007 was a shock to our system, but the story goes back very far. I'll take it back a century to demonstrate that the issues revealed by this exhibition are not unique to the 1930s. They existed before, and they exist now in one form or another. The forces that culminated in the Great Depression were a pot coming to a boil, not just the events of October 29, 1929. The crash was the event we think of as precipitating the long years of hardship, but in fact, many of the same kinds of problems have led to the most recent economic collapse. In the 1981 film Rads, which is an epic film and I highly recommend it, John Reed, played by Warren Beatty, gives a soliloquy on the economic issues preceding World War I. The characters, the countries, the issues, very little from generation to generation. Occupy Wall Street rose up in reaction to the inequality and unfairness in our banking system, just as John Reed railed against it a century earlier.
All right, Miss Bryant, you want an interview? Write this down. Are you naive enough to think containing German militarism has anything to do with this war? Don't you understand that England and France own the world economy and Germany just wants a piece of it? Keep writing, Miss Bryant. Miss Bryant, can't you grasp that J.P. Morgan has loaned England and France $1 billion, and if Germany wins, he won't get it back? More coffee? America'd be entering the war to protect J.P. Morgan's money. If he loses it, we'll have a depression. So the real question is, why do we have an economy where the poor have to pay so the rich won't lose money?
Nothing ever changes. In John Ford's Grapes of Wrath, based on Steinbeck's novel, it was made in 1940. It's an intense and moving film about a multi-generational family suffering through the awful consequences of the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma. Bible's multi-generational family, eating and sleeping in the same room in Depression family interior, was drawn 4 years earlier in 1936. Artists and writers and filmmakers were driven to tell these stories of struggle and courage in the face of utter despair. The imperfections of our democracy are shown in one iconic tableau in the Shadow of Liberty. The single dark cloud does not bode well. The Statue of Liberty symbolizes many virtues, yet Bible sees the dichotomy. The statue may stand in the harbor, but it doesn't protect against unfairness and injustice on the ground. A year later, in 1937, Ida Abelman, another federal art project artist, was moved in much the same way by the same notion. Bible tackles lynching and police actions and protest and the unemployed. And Ida, please forgive. Okay, and Ida, in this piece called My Father Reminiscence, Ida has her disembodied signs floating as ideals that last forever: suffrage, better working conditions, fighting for unions. She also references immigrants and sweatshops. And I do want to say here that critics of so much imagery and symbolism crammed into the art felt that some of these works were too didactic, and basically that they were just, in today's terms, too much information. But for many who viewed the art in community galleries or FAP centers, this was often their first experience with original art. Now, in Renaissance paintings, there were colors that symbolized royalty in the church, flowers that referred to a certain saint, and those representations could be interpreted by the viewers, many of whom couldn't read, but they knew the stories. The desire to either directly show and name or through some other device, make a point, tell a story, is much the same in these two very different eras. What they had in common was government or church as government support, sponsorship of the arts in a concentrated period in flourishing centers with the exchange of ideas, methods, and techniques. The WPA Federal Art Project was the most comprehensive government sponsorship of the arts in the world since the Renaissance. In Mass, Bible rips directly from the headlines of his subject matter. A Catholic priest, Charles Coughlin, originally a supporter of Roosevelt and his New Deal policies, later became a vicious critic of the administration, and somehow his focus narrowed to making virulent anti-Semitic attacks. Since he broadcast on the radio, his views spread quickly and his following as well. He had millions of listeners and grew flush with the influence he had, getting more and more brazen until his attacks on so-called Jewish conspirators revealed his support for the fascist governments of Hitler and Mussolini. He called his magazine Social Justice, a completely Orwellian notion, simply a cloaked title under which he vilified Jews, aligning them with communists, and in the same vein supported the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. Then Sean did his interpretation of Coughlin, and this wonderful print by Hugo Gellert called Pieces of Silver shows the complete hypocrisy. Coughlin is divided in half of him is in clerical garb and making a religious sign, and the other half of him is in a business suit with his hands on a bag of money. Bible's repeated forms, very static in nature, is a purposeful device. Here is a demagogue spewing a hateful message, yet the figures are docile and compliant, hanging on every word. The floor beneath them is like a chessboard, showing them as manipulated pieces in a game. In the superb 1937 film Grand Illusion, we have a border dispute, a drawing in the exhibition, and on the right is a still from Grand Illusion showing a German and a French officer. The French officer has been captured by the German, but they're of the same social class, so they understand each other very well. Made in light of World War I and another impending war, there is an exploration of the absurdity of many imposed delineations. Lines on a map, nationality, military rank, or social class. Okay, just so sorry. Throughout the film, we are witness to how these borders, these divisions, interfere with so many aspects of society and culture. And in the stunning ending, they are proven doomed and useless. In Border Dispute, Bible shows two powerful men on pieces of land that he depicts as desolate puzzle pieces. I'm just having a little trouble with one thing. I'm sorry. Please forgive. Okay. I don't know. Oh. There seems to be a little problem in. Let's see if this works. Oops.
It's just, the borders that you drew.
Oh, so sorry, but I'll let it go. Just
be a little.
I'm sorry. We're just having. Here we go. Sorry. So he shows these two men on pieces of land which he depicts as desolate puzzle pieces. They are now fighting for one small island with the only signs of life floating between them. He did this drawing in 1936, a year before the film, again showing the impressions of a very young, aware artist about these issues. The drive to make this presentation as relevant as possible to the present took an amazing turn when I tuned into The Daily Show 2 weeks ago and watched this segment, jaw dropped. It is really worth watching in its entirety, yet the more things change, they do stay the same. So here are this work from the 30s and film from the 30s talking about borders and divisions, and then...
It's just, the borders that you drew back after World War I, well, they've proven to be a little unstable and somewhat controversial.
Really? Not a problem. We'll just draw them again.
Right, well...
No problem. Yep.
That's the problem. You're a little cavalier about that.
Right, well, this time I'll take great care. Quick scribble on the old glove. I guarantee you, before you know it, Bob's your uncle, it's gin o'clock. Let's take a look. Yep. I see your problem right here. The lines are too squiggly, John. As my father once told me, when borders get squiggly, people get squiggly. What you want is a nice straight line, John. A nice straight line, straight as you can, like that. Lovely.
Yeah, that's what you've done there, actually, though, is You've taken some land from Turkey, and then now you've got a Kurdish population there in a disputed zone.
A
So
what?
that-
In a who? Living in a where, John?
Women at the Front depicts one of the unusual times in history when women fought on the front lines in the Spanish Civil War. Simone de Beauvoir once wrote that one of the worst tragedies for women is that they were not allowed to participate in war, because war is when men have shown that they care more for ideals like freedom, democracy, and justice, and thus become fully human, than they care for their own narrow self-interest. She wrote this during the French resistance to the Nazi occupation, and ironically, just a country away, women were participating on the front lines in a terrible conflict. The artist Elizabeth Olds also interpreted this phenomenon in the New Women of Spain. She and Leon Bibel were friends working together on the Federal Art Project. In Refugees, this family holds on to each other and their last possessions, while planes above threaten every step. Their heads are bowed, their composition is akin to one of the Renaissance. The road sign is blank, there are no good options. The fires rage in the direction they are headed, and no one can possibly imagine the shock of what they have just experienced. In Disasters of War, done in 1810, Goya witnessed guerrilla warfare similar to that in Franco's Spain. He saw snipers and firing squads firsthand and recorded them, wanting to, as they said, clarify the confused first impression of intense experiences. The Spanish Civil War was the first conflict in history in which aerial bombardment was used to target civilians. Picasso's Guernica, painted in 1937, is the most renowned response to the bombing of a Basque village by that name by German and Italian forces allied with Franco. A powerful anti-war symbol, it conveys the chaos and brutality of the airstrikes and the tragic loss of life. Picasso had been commissioned to paint another mural for this 1937 World's Fair in Paris, and after reading an eyewitness account of the bombing, he dropped his original notion and began his emotional response to the tragedy. And we'll see coming up very soon that Leon did exactly the same thing. Exile is often a consequence of war, and in this stone lithograph, the influence of the Mexican muralists is again unmistakable. The approach is simple and spare, and Bibel later did a full-scale version of this painting, of this print. In the profound documentary film, The Rape of Europa, footage of the Nazi entrance into Paris was shown. In the narration, it is explained that the French had been prepared for aerial bombing, but they weren't expecting a full-scale invasion of their country. France fell in 6 weeks. Leon wrote in 1988, "I remember working on a litho print at the Harlem Art Center and listening to the radio when an announcement was made that Paris had fallen to the Germans. I stopped the original stone, started a new one, and completed the day Paris fell in 1 day." The radio reports were the first indication that Nazis were overtaking the city. Bibel's compositions are usually quite masterful and elegant. This is essentially hot off the press, raw emotion, and his response is not carefully planned out. The immediacy of it is palpable. The composition is fractured, spontaneous, veering into surrealism with its exaggerated elements. It's a world that's gone mad, and there's no narrative order. There's no narrative here that can be orderly. And whereas I have found evidence in Bibel's archives of original sketching for almost all of the finished work, this was the only finished product that had no trace of preparation, seeming to underscore the accuracy of his recollection. The same day, the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, in this iconic photograph, caught the unspeakable sadness of one Parisian watching the scene of the Nazis entering Paris without showing a single soldier. Mustard gas and other chemical weapons were used in World War I, and they're in the news too. They killed and injured many thousands. Gas masks were a form of protection, but many artists used the idea of not having to face your enemy thus rendering him inhuman to decry war. Joseph LeBoyd's tranquility, this is a hit you over the head with the message kind of image. It's an ironic view of the artist in the time of war. The artist wears a gas mask. He's painting an abstract painting at his easel while planes are decimating the landscape outside of his window. And basically, it's a very direct statement. Social realism is a better tool than abstraction to call attention to injustice. And a topic for another day is really the differing opinions of WPA artists. You know, there were many abstract painters, and they felt very differently about the subject, but we can't cover that today. Sue Coe is a very gifted British artist. She is a contemporary political artist, and the image of women in gas masks is her response to the first Gulf War. While organizing Leon's archives, I discovered that in the 1980s, the art of Sue Coe and Bibel had been shown together in an exhibition. And as I was preparing this exhibition, I couldn't believe that this presentation, the front page of the New York Times in late August, reinforced the notion that nothing ever changes. And here we are, 2 weeks ago. An anti-lynching bill was making its way through Congress in 1938. It followed a rash of 28 lynchings, primarily in the South, the year before. Leon Bibel did these drawings depicting the power of mob rule and then the attempt to fight back. He was deeply affected by a clipping from a contemporary newspaper account of a lynching, which is in the display case in the exhibition. The victims' names were Julie Morton and Bert Moore, and the madness took place in Columbus, Mississippi. Bibel could have also been aware of the poem Strange Fruit by Abel Meeropol, which had been published in the New Masses. Billie Holiday later recorded an iconic version of the poem in song. Other artists, such as Louis Lozowick and Philip Buston, this is Lozowick and Philip Buston, also interpreted these widely reported murders. In the lynching, Bibel, he tackles this unspeakable subject. Compositionally, it breaks every rule with its massive tree, vertically dividing the narrative in half. The man is shown with fist and jaw clenched, his eyes glaring, his body rigid, watching with a protecting tree, keeping him from sight. The woman's eyes are tightly shut, her body limp from the stress as she clings to the man. These figures are fully realized, whereas the KKK figures are reduced to sheets with cutout eyes. They've lost their humanity. They are plunged into the nightmarish destruction of life and landscape. The figures are strange fruit, shown on dead trees, broken trees, while the protecting tree is strong with powerfully meandering roots and branches filled with leaves, the dividing line between the just and the unjust, the humanity and the degradation of humanity. FDR spoke up at last, condemning lynching, but he didn't publicly support the bill. Southern conservative senators threatened to block every bill to provide jobs programs, which was still desperately needed to stabilize the country's economic situation. The bill was defeated. Sound familiar? The situation was similar to the one Thomas Jefferson faced while writing the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Northern and Southern delegates engaged in the slave trade formed an alliance. They threatened Jefferson, either excise the passage on slavery or forget independence. Benjamin Franklin urged Jefferson to accept the terms, thinking that once the first step towards independence was taken, they would be able to correct the deficiencies later on. But we all know what happened. The scourge of slavery continued with full participation by some of our founding fathers, leading to the Civil War and its aftermath, leading to lingering racism and many horrific lynchings. It was no accident that in 1998, people reacted so incredibly seriously and with great passion to the awful deaths of Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. The same kinds of crimes as lynching. One was gay, one was black. They encountered the wrong men at the wrong time and were savagely murdered. Hate crimes were not on the books when these perpetrators were charged. There was a fierce struggle to identify certain offenses as hate crimes that went on for years through 3 administrations. Finally, in late 2009, crimes based on targeting of race or sexual orientation were made prosecutable as hate crimes, resulting in much stiffer penalties. It was continuing public demonstrations and pressure, activism, that produced this outcome. In modern times, made in 1936, the opening frame shows sheep hurrying down a narrow passage. The scene flows one into another, with people pouring out of the subway in a droned, repetitive stream. The wonder of assembly lines had been touted by Henry Ford as an extraordinary leap forward. The assembly line scene a bit later in the film shows the so-called advancement to have a very negative side. Chaplin's early life was very difficult, and he suffered from extreme poverty, and before the age of 10, he was left to make his way in the world on his own. His strong sense of social justice and concern for those at the margins of society was rooted in his own deprivation. Bible often depicted repeated figures, graphically very powerful, to emphasize that the narrative was not just about one person, but that others could call their own. This is called unemployed marchers. In a documentary about Sackel and Vanzetti, we learned that 35,000 workers were killed each year in industrial accidents in the early 1900s. Most of these people were immigrants. In Machinery Devours, we are focused like a laser on the worker being crushed by the machine. Situations where worker safety was less important than profit were not uncommon in an era with a glut of workers. As we look at a panel from Diego Rivera's Ford Company murals in Detroit, I also want to mention the man in the bowler is also in Rivera's panel. He talks about the inequities on the assembly line, that blacks and Mexicans were often made to do the more difficult foundry work, that there was a constant shifting set of faces, that they didn't want people to sort of organize or unionize, and so they kept cutting schedules, and so much of it sounded like what's going on in some of the workforce today. Before she was elected to the Senate in 2012, Elizabeth Warren had been writing and teaching about how financial instruments were written by lobbyists and business interests to purposely be too complex to understand and interpret. And in a 2007 interview in a segment of Conversations with History, she explains how ordinary citizens are at the mercy of a very small minority. This group has the resources to take control of the legislative process and to prevent fairness. She makes clear that the very sliver of the top of the population at the top of the economic heap not only has most of the money, but most of the power and influence as well. Warren states that the framework for growing inequality in the US started in the early 1970s, and it's taken until this moment in history to wake up to it. And this is a more recent graph, making our situation even possibly worse than it had been. That inequity, so put under the microscope by Occupy Wall Street, is the same inequality that Gordon Gekko waxed rhapsodically about in the gripping Oliver Stone movie Wall Street, when he said, the richest 1% of the country owns about half the country's wealth, $5 trillion. You've got 90% of the American public out there with little or no net worth. I create nothing, I own. We make the rules, pals. The news, war, peace, famine, upheaval, the price per paper clip. And if you live in New York City or have ever taken the New York City subway, Tom Otterness is a sculptor whose figures, they look cartoonish, but actually they're very political. And so he paints he has these wonderful bronzes with figures with top hats and bowlers, here they go again, and on bags of money or with coins, and you might just go into a subway platform and then they'd be right there. Or you go into Hudson River Park and there'd be these wonderful sculptural groups. And the most amazing thing is the top hat and the bowler. You see the man in the corner there, and he's also in another one. They represented power and influence and people with money. And so this link between Bible and odderness, this contemporary artist, was very powerful for me. Land did some painting for a Federal Theater Project production, and in Tim Robbins' extraordinary film made in 1999, Cradle Rock, it's based on the true story of the Federal Theater Project in New York City. Its trials, its successes, Diego Rivera's mural catastrophe with Nelson Rockefeller in Rockefeller Center, and international political intrigue. It's a very compelling window to that time, and when Hallie Flanagan, the director of the Federal Theater Project, and there's a photograph of the real Hallie in the display case, when she testified before the Dice Committee in Congress on behalf of the project, she was shown enormous disrespect and was labeled a communist sympathizer. And this is just a snippet of the film, but it's really based on truth, and the film is wonderful.
The workers' theaters intend to remake a social structure without the help of money, and this ambition alone invests their undertaking with a certain Marlowe-esque madness. You are quoting from this Marlowe. Is he a communist?
I'm very sorry, I was quoting from Christopher Marlowe.
Tell us who this Marlowe is so we can get the proper reference, because that is all we want to do.
Put in the record that he was the greatest dramatist in the period of Shakespeare immediately preceding Shakespeare.
The members of Congress were really wary of these federal art projects and work projects because they worried about the people perceiving that the Democrats were giving people work and they would have a majority as far as the eye could see. So the Republican members of Congress were constantly trying to scale back the programs or eliminate them altogether. And as a matter of fact, Congressman Dyes actually said that he relished his role in killing the theater project and said of his committee's role in terminating it, that it was its most important accomplishment. And I thought a few weeks ago when John Boehner said, you know, his job as Republican House Majority Leader is not to make laws, but to repeal them. And that's not at all what I thought our Congresspeople were supposed to do. Well, thank you so much. I know it was a fast New Yorker ride. Here are some works cited, images that I used, and books that were used in the research. And if anybody would like to see that at length, I'll be glad to share it with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Phyllis. That was an extraordinary presentation. Very inspiring. What attracted me to this period of art and printmaking is the integrity of the work, the diversity of the expression, and the directness of the art that was made during the period. The WPA, one of its intentions was to bring art to the people, to make art part of people's lives and integrate life into the everyday experience of Americans. Printmaking played a key role in that printmaking was a focus of the WPA because it could be produced in multiples. Let me just clarify what a print is, what a fine print is. We're not talking about reproductions, we're talking about an original work of art that was created with the intention of being editioned or produced in a multiple. Most of the work in the WPA was editioned in numbers of 25 or less. So they were not big editions. And to give any kind of comprehensive view of the printmaking that was being produced by the WPA would be impossible. There was actually
2,000 artists employed by the WPA. So I can only attempt to give a few examples of some of the work that was being done to give a little context to what was going on during the period that Leon Bible was creating the extraordinary work that he did. I have always admired his work from the first time I saw it, and was immediately attracted to his compassion and his authenticity. This work is created by Stuart Davis in 1931. It's called 6th Avenue L. It's a New York City image. Davis was one of the youngest artists to show. He was 17 years old in the Armory Show of 1913. And he was greatly influenced. At that time, his work was more representational, traditional. He was greatly influenced by the modernism that was exhibited at the Armory. A lot of it came from Europe. And by the 1920s, he had evolved his mature style of hard-edged abstraction, which this work is representative of. He took his inspiration from the things that he saw around him. And although he was a teacher and an advocate of abstract art, which at the time a lot of people were opposed to abstraction, it was not something that was commonly accepted. But despite that, he didn't like being categorized as an abstract artist. He said about his own work, "I paint what I see in America. In other words, I paint the American scene." So much of what was going on in the WPA was these artists who were trying to create an authentic vernacular of American art that was distinct to America and separate from what had been done in Europe. And they were adopting influences and evolutions from Europe, but they were not trying to emulate what was going on there. This work is by Martin Lewis, called Glow the City, 1929. This was completed a couple of months before the infamous stock market crash that basically launched the Depression. Lewis was a technical virtuoso in dry point, and he could create light, and particularly he did a lot of nocturne scenes. Nuances of light were probably unequaled by any other American printmaker of the period. But here it shows that he's very aware of the dichotomy between the tenement dweller who's in the foreground looking through the hanging laundry at the building in the distance, which is the Chain building, which at the time was the tallest building in Manhattan. And they had a kind of a brilliant illumination at the top so that they could be seen all over New York City. So there is that the power and affluence represented by the Chain building that really is never going to be attainable to the woman in the foreground, the common tenement dweller. Lewis is an example of an artist who was very proficient at his medium and technically adept. A lot of the movement in the WPA period was away from technical virtuosity to forms that were more expressive and more immediate. This is a work by Reginald Marsh called Breadline. No One Has Starved, 1932. So there's a bit of sarcasm in that title. By 1932, unemployment had reached an unprecedented level in the United States. And in New York, there was points set up where food was distributed, basically, so people wouldn't starve. So Marsh is depicting that. This is has a lot in common with the repeating figures that the Bible was working with. Marsh shows this in kind of a frieze-like manner, so that the line itself is endless. It has no beginning and end. And he's more interested in the energy of the depressed period rather than the individuals. This is one more Marsh image done in 1934. It's called Smoke Hounds. These are the title refers to the Bowery dwellers' intoxication from cheap alcohol, which was popularly called smoke. And here you can see the figures struggling with their addiction, and also very much a part of the architecture around them, sort of almost indistinguishable. So the environment very much oppressive and part of the difficulties. This is a 1939 image titled Departure of the Jodes. And this is commissioned by 20th Century Fox by Thomas Hart Benton to promote the motion 1940 motion picture, The Grapes of Wrath, which is based on the Steinbeck novel. And the story is of the Jodes, an Oklahoma family who, after losing their farm during the Great Depression, go searching for work and ultimately end up in California and all the struggles that they endure. Here you can see the figures in the image bent over in shadow, the woman in the center of the picture being held up by the man, the clouds in the background representing perhaps the forces of nature overwhelming them. The film itself was one of 25 films to be selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. One of Benton's students in the WPA was Jackson Pollock. And interestingly, Pollock, according to his contemporaries, idealized Benton to the point where he adopted even his style of dress and manner of speaking. This is one of the prints that he created during the WPA, and you can see with the composition and the contrast of the diagonals and the energy of the figures, his interest in abstraction coming to the front. Pollock, of course, went on to be a major figure in abstract expressionism and to develop his own form of abstract expressionist painting and drip painting, which has made him one of the most important figures in American art. The title of this work is Coal Miners, West Virginia. It's 1936. Coal mining was a concern of a lot of WPA artists, and the abuses of which the miners had to endure was a subject of concern. This is a work by David Burke, who is a New York WPA artist, and the medium here is silkscreen. Silkscreen medium was something that was developed during the WPA for fine art, and prior to that had been used for posters and billboards and that kind of thing, but not as a fine art medium. And it had quite a range of diversity. Could be used in different modes of expression in different forms. This is an example where it's used in a painterly fashion. Burke was one of the artists in the WPA who created some wonderfully expressive work, but nothing is known about him. We don't even have a birth or a death date for him. And it was one of the artists who disappeared after the closing of the WPA. So that was the case of a number of artists who found relief during the WPA and then afterwards went on to do something else and disappeared. This work is called Counterpoint. It's by Edward Landon, 1942. Edward Landon was a painter in the WPA and then discovered silkscreen printmaking and pursued that almost exclusively after he got involved with the medium. He became a teacher. He developed his whole career to silkscreen printmaking, developed his own sort of beautiful vernacular in it, and even went to Scandinavia and Europe and taught it and advocated it. In this work, he's developed two or three different groups of types of marks that are simultaneously balancing each other. And from that, he derives the title Counterpoint, which is also alluding to the musical meaning. This is a work by Joseph Vogel, another artist who was born in Poland, came to the United States in 1927 with his family. And at the time he was greatly influenced by Picasso's Guernica, which was then on display in the Museum of Modern Art. And you can see how he's adopted but made his own a lot of the characteristics of Picasso's modernist work. In 1937, he volunteered to go to Spain with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to fight Franco's fascism. And he fought in the front, in the Cordoba front. So this imagery is a very direct experience of that experience. This is a work by Rockwell Kent. It's titled And Now Where, 1936. Over here, Kent is depicting a couple that's been dispossessed, lost their home, and their future is uncertain. Yet, Kent renders them in a monumental way. And basically, the figures remain heroic even though they are uncertain. Kent was one of the most successful printmakers of the period. In 1930s, he achieved his greatest popularity, and in a 1936 survey of Prince magazine, he was nominated and voted the most successful printmaker in the country. He was also a champion of many popular causes, and although he never belonged to the Communist Party, his support of radical causes caused the State Department to revoke his passport. He challenged that and actually won in a Supreme Court case, and subsequently became very popular in the Soviet Union. In 1957, his work was shown in Russia, and 500,000 people attended the exhibition. In 1967, he was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize, and with the prize money, he specified that the money should go to the women and children of Vietnam, both North and South. This is a more typical image of Kent's. It's called Over the Ultimate. It's 1926, so it's earlier. But Kent was very interested in the elemental forces, the wilderness, nature, and he was a transcendentalist mystic in the tradition of Thoreau and Emerson. He said about his own work, I don't want petty self-expression. I want the elemental infinite thing. I want to paint the rhythm of eternity. These are two works by Samuel Margulies. Similar in subject matter. These are the steel workers of the high-rises of Manhattan. In 1935, Margulies joined the Federal Arts Project and worked as an instructor. And his etchings were also displayed in New York's World's Fair in 1939. These works were published by Associated American Artists, who was a major publisher of American prints in the 30s and 40s, and distributed these prints widely. They were not part of the WBA, but they were certainly benefited from the WPA's promotion of printmaking. This is a work by Robert Gwathmey. Gwathmey was actually a native of Richmond. This is called Hitchhiker. It's from 1937. And it's basically autobiographical. Gwathmey used to hitchhike from the north back to Virginia. And it's an interesting image because, he's contrasting the billboard, glamour of the billboard figures with the unemployed worker on the other side of the road with his thumb out, and with his own situation of having to hitchhike. It's also interesting in that it is really a precursor to pop art, but one that's been largely unrecognized. This is another Gwathmey work called Rural Homefront, 1942. This was a work that was done for the America at War Artists for Victory project, and it won the prize for the Serigraph in the 1943 competition. The infant in the middle of the work there is Charles Gwathmey, his son, who went on to become one of the most important architects in the 20th century. The Artists for Victory was an organization of 10,000 American artists who organized to support the war effort. And a large exhibition of the group's work was mounted at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is a work by Benjamin Spruance. It's called Riders of the Apocalypse. This is from 1934, one of his best-known works, and here he's working in the Cubist precisionist vernacular to render an image of the bombers' carpet bombing of Germany during World War II. This was pretty much right at the close of the WPA. Most of the artists by this time had left the WPA and were involved in war efforts. This last work is also by Benton Spruance, called Subway Shift, the Second Front. In this image, the faces of the people here are mask-like, their eyes are hollow. Each one is wearing a button with their own image, and they're reading Dick Tracy and True Confessions. So you can see by this image that Spruance didn't value the contribution of the Second Front too highly. This image in stark contrast to the one we just saw by Guathamy, where the rural family goes about their work with dignity and is supporting the war in the way that they can contribute to preserving the homeland. So that's the last image I have to show, and the work is very varied, but it's consistent in the themes of engagement and activism. All the artists were very involved in the times and in their concerns with the period. So, thank you.